In the hazy golden light of ancient Egypt, a striking figure stands before massive obelisks that stretch into the sky like fingers touching the divine. Her brow is firm, her gaze unwavering. Though her body is clearly that of a woman, she wears the garb of a king, a ceremonial kilt, the heavy royal headdress, and most remarkably, the false beard worn by Egypt's pharaohs. This is not a queen standing by her husband's side, nor a consort quietly reigning from the shadows. This is Hatshepsut, the woman who would become a king. Her image, carved into limestone and towering over the sands, challenges everything one expects from a civilization that, while revering women in daily life, still largely reserved ultimate power for men. In that brief moment captured in stone, we glimpse a world transformed, a story of ambition, divine legitimacy, and a legacy both revered and nearly erased. To truly appreciate the enormity of Hatshepsut's achievement, it is essential to understand the world into which she was born. Egypt, around 1500 BCE, was a land rising from a dark period. The collapse of the Middle Kingdom had left the once mighty civilization fractured and vulnerable. Foreign rulers, the Hyksos, had seized power in the north, bringing unfamiliar customs and unsettling changes. Egypt's sense of divine order, or Ma'at, had been disrupted. But from the turmoil rose a resurgence, the New Kingdom, a period that would see Egypt ascend to even greater heights than before. Military leaders like Ahmose I expelled the Hyksos and reasserted Egyptian dominance. The 18th dynasty was founded, a dynasty that would later include some of the most renowned names in Egyptian history: Thutmose III, Akhenaten, and Tutankhamun. Yet, even among these illustrious figures, Hatshepsut stands apart. Her reign is not just significant because she ruled. It is significant because of how she ruled, why she ruled, and the tremendous challenges she overcame to do so. In an ancient world where rulership was intertwined with religious legitimacy, military prowess, and masculine identity, Hatshepsut boldly redefined kingship itself. Her reign forced her people, and later historians, to grapple with profound questions about power, gender, and legacy. What happens when someone shatters the expectations of who a ruler should be? Can success ever protect one's memory from the political ambitions of successors? These questions echo through the corridors of time, and Hatshepsut's life offers fascinating, complex answers. The story of Hatshepsut cannot be understood without first immersing ourselves in the Egypt she inherited. Around 1500 BCE, political consolidation had begun to restore Egypt's strength. Trade routes were reopening, temples were being rebuilt, and the nation's religious fervor was reaching new heights. Egypt was not merely a collection of cities and fields. It was a tightly woven tapestry of gods, kings, and natural forces, each element reinforcing the divine order. Kings were seen not just as rulers, but as living gods, intermediaries between the mortal and divine realms. Stability, prosperity, and piety were essential elements of kingship. The religious landscape was dominated by the worship of gods like Ammonius, who had risen to prominence during the wars to reclaim Egypt from the Hyksos. Ammonius was not just a creator god. He embodied hiddenness, mystery, and the unseen forces that governed the universe. As the chief deity of Thebes, Ammonius' influence stretched into politics, legitimizing rulers through sacred rituals. The priesthood of Ammonius wielded tremendous power, rivaling even the authority of the throne itself at times. This religious political nexus would play a critical role in Hatshepsut's story. Amidst this reborn Egypt, Hatshepsut was born into one of the most powerful families in history. Her father, Thutmose I, was a warrior king who had expanded Egypt's borders through successful military campaigns. Her mother, Queen Ahmose, was likely of royal blood herself, possibly a direct link to the previous dynasty. This lineage gave Hatshepsut a unique position. Unlike many royal women, who were often daughters of lesser wives or secondary queens, Hatshepsut was the child of the great royal wife, a title that signified primary status. From birth, she was closer to the throne than most princesses ever dared to dream. The role of women in ancient Egypt was unlike that in most other ancient civilizations. Egyptian women could own property, initiate divorce, and act as legal equals in many matters. Some had even acted as regents, temporarily ruling on behalf of underage sons. Yet, while women wielded considerable personal freedom and influence, the title of Pharaoh remained overwhelmingly male. Kingship was intimately tied to the masculine, with symbols like the crook and flail, the bull's tail, and of course the false beard, reinforcing this gendered imagery. A woman might rule behind the scenes or as regent, but to claim the kingship fully was almost unthinkable. Yet from her earliest days, Hatshepsut was positioned for greatness. She was given the title God's wife of Ammonius, an immensely powerful and sacred position. As God's wife, she participated in elaborate temple rituals, handled temple wealth, and maintained the divine connection between Ammonius and the royal house. This title granted her an independent source of power, wealth, and prestige, a foundation she would later build upon when asserting her right to rule. Her upbringing likely included rigorous education, not just in religious rites but also in diplomacy, administration, and perhaps even military strategy. She would have been steeped in the rich traditions of Egyptian mythology, history, and governance, preparing her for a life that, while initially expected to be conventional for a royal woman, would instead shatter every norm. From an early age, there were signs that Hatshepsut's destiny would not follow the usual path. As the favored daughter of a powerful king and queen, she enjoyed privileges rare even among royalty. She would have been present at court ceremonies, foreign delegations, and temple rites. She would have observed the levers of power being pulled, not just by her father, but by the priests, generals, and administrators who formed the backbone of Egypt's elite. She would have understood that power was both a divine right and a game of strategy, a lesson that would serve her well in the years to come. It is easy to imagine a young Hatshepsut walking through the towering colonnades of Karnak Temple, observing the murals that depicted her ancestors' victories, understanding that her bloodline tied her to both gods and kings. In those shadowed halls, she would have learned not only the responsibilities of royalty, but also the possibilities. The gods had made the pharaohs male by tradition, but had they forbidden a woman from ascending if she was the most capable? It was a question that may have lingered in her mind, unspoken but ever present, as she watched the gears of Egyptian power turn. Thus, by the time her father died, Hatshepsut was not just another royal woman to be married off for alliances. She was an asset, a political figure in her own right, with sacred and dynastic legitimacy. Her marriage to her half-brother, Thutmose II, was less a romance than a political necessity, ensuring that the royal bloodline remained concentrated and unbroken. Yet even as queen, Hatshepsut's role exceeded the traditional bounds. Thutmose II was by all accounts a weak ruler, perhaps suffering from poor health, and it is likely that Hatshepsut took on significant administrative duties behind the scenes during his reign. In these early years, the seeds of her future kingship were planted. She cultivated key allies among the priesthood and bureaucracy. She maintained her powerful religious titles. She presented herself not just as queen, but as an indispensable pillar of Egypt's governance. When Thutmose II died young, leaving behind only a child heir from a secondary wife, Hatshepsut stood at the crossroads of destiny. Egypt faced a familiar yet precarious situation. A minor king too young to rule, a court filled with powerful men each with their own ambitions, and the ever-present need for stability in a land where kingship was divine. Into this breach stepped Hatshepsut, not as a passive regent waiting for Thutmose III to come of age, but as a ruler who would, over time, reshape the very concept of kingship to include herself. As we move forward in the story, it becomes clear that Hatshepsut's rise was not a simple power grab nor a temporary guardianship. It was a carefully orchestrated transformation. She did not immediately seize the title of pharaoh. Rather, she gradually accumulated honors, titles, and symbols of power until the distinction between regent and king blurred, and then disappeared altogether. Her lineage, her role as God's wife, and her understanding of the religious and political machinery allowed her to claim the throne with a brilliance unmatched in Egyptian history. Yet the obstacles she faced were immense. Gender expectations were deeply ingrained in Egyptian theology and politics. Every pharaoh before her had been male, depicted with the strength and virility symbolized by bulls and falcons. Hatshepsut would have to convince not just the elite, but the common people that a woman could embody these qualities. She would have to reinvent the image of kingship while remaining true to its core ideals, a balancing act that demanded extraordinary intellect, charisma, and political acumen. Hatshepsut's early life, her education, her sacred roles, and her lineage all combined to forge a woman uniquely suited to defy tradition. She was born into a world on the rise, a civilization regaining its strength and divine favor. She was raised amidst the grandeur of temples and courts, taught the sacred mysteries of Ammonius, and schooled in the intricate dance of Egyptian politics. When the moment came, she did not falter. She stepped forward, donning the crown, the headdress, and the false beard, not as a queen regent waiting for a boy to grow into power, but as a king in her own right, one who would leave an indelible mark on history. Hatshepsut's ascent toward extraordinary power began not with grand declarations or military victories, but with the careful accumulation of sacred titles that intertwined her destiny with the gods themselves. Among these titles, none was more significant or more telling of her future ambitions than God's wife of Ammonius. To modern eyes, the title may sound purely religious, a ceremonial honor bestowed upon a favored royal daughter. But in the Egypt of the New Kingdom, it carried both spiritual gravitas and immense political weight. As God's wife of Ammonius, Hatshepsut was not merely a figurehead. She was a living symbol of the divine connection between Ammonius, the hidden god, the creator of all things, and the royal house of Egypt. She performed essential rituals that reaffirmed the god's presence on earth, rituals that ordinary priests were forbidden to perform. Her hands anointed the sacred images, her voice sang the holy hymns, her body itself was viewed as a vessel through which the divine could touch the world. In a society where the gods were real, where storms, floods, and victories were seen as divine messages, this role was more than piety. It was power. Holding this title also gave her control over immense temple wealth. The temples of Ammonius, especially the sprawling complex at Karnak, were among the richest institutions in Egypt. Lands, workers, herds, and goods flowed into their coffers. To administer even a fraction of this wealth was to possess influence that could rival generals and viziers. In being named God's wife, Hatshepsut gained not just spiritual legitimacy, but an independent power base within the religious heart of Egypt. It was an early foundation stone for the kingdom she would one day claim. Her education reflected the sacred and political weight of her upbringing. Hatshepsut would not have learned in the traditional sense of classrooms and scrolls, but through a life immersed in ritual, governance, and courtly performance. She would have been taught the complex religious ceremonies that honored the gods, particularly Ammonius. She would have memorized the ancient hymns, mastered the secret rituals, and learned the sacred myths that tied Egypt's destiny to the heavens. At the same time, she would have been trained in diplomacy, the art of receiving foreign dignitaries, the careful phrasing of royal correspondence, the subtle hierarchies of the court. She would have learned the names and temperaments of powerful nobles, understood the shifting alliances among priests, generals, and administrators. Her world was a gilded cage and a brutal training ground. The royal court was not merely a place of opulence and ceremony. It was a theater of ambition, where smiles could hide daggers and every word carried weight. Expectations were enormous. As the daughter of the great royal wife and a favorite of Thutmose III, she was expected to embody both the ideals of Egyptian womanhood and the grandeur of her lineage. She had to be pious yet commanding, graceful yet astute. Every step, every word, every offering at a temple mattered, for it reflected upon the royal house and upon Egypt itself. Growing up within this environment shaped Hatshepsut into a woman who understood power not as brute force but as performance, persuasion, and sacred duty. She observed how kings ruled not just by edict but through spectacle. The grand building projects, the temple dedications, the public ceremonies that reinforced the pharaoh's divine right. She learned that to rule Egypt was to weave a tapestry of political, religious, and symbolic authority so dense and overwhelming that it seemed unquestionable. These lessons would remain with her throughout her life, giving her the tools she would later use to claim and justify her kingship. As she came of age, Hatshepsut's life was shaped by dynastic needs rather than personal desires. Her marriage to Thutmose II, her half-brother, was not a union born of love, but of political necessity. In the rigid logic of Egyptian royal succession, bloodline purity was paramount. By marrying Hatshepsut, Thutmose II bolstered his claim to the throne, linking his lineage to that of the great royal wife and the earlier rulers. It was an arrangement that satisfied the gods, the court, and the people, at least on the surface. Yet beneath this veneer of stability, tensions brewed. Thutmose II, though king in name, lacked the commanding presence and military vigor of his father, Thutmose I. Historical records hint at a ruler overshadowed by his advisors and generals, perhaps even his queen. His reign saw fewer military campaigns, fewer grand building projects, and a general sense that he was a caretaker king rather than a conqueror. Into this vacuum of power stepped Hatshepsut, exercising influence behind the throne with a subtlety and grace that only years of court training could have prepared her for. She was no mere ornament at court. As queen, she would have had her own estates, her own retinue, her own advisors. She would have presided over religious festivals, administered temple properties, and engaged in diplomatic functions. It is very likely that she took on administrative responsibilities typically reserved for the pharaoh, especially when Thutmose II's health or indecisiveness limited his involvement. Without openly challenging her husband's authority, Hatshepsut positioned herself as an indispensable partner in governance, a stabilizing force within the royal court. Her role became even more crucial with the birth of her daughter, Neferur. For a dynasty still cementing its legitimacy after the upheavals of previous centuries, the continuation of the royal line was of paramount importance. Neferur's birth was not just a personal joy but a political event, celebrated with rituals, dedications, and perhaps even whispered hopes that the child might one day rule. Hatshepsut, understanding the weight of dynastic continuity, ensured that her daughter was raised in the heart of the royal and religious establishment. Neferur would receive training similar to her mother's, in ritual, in courtly decorum, and perhaps even in matters of governance. However, the dynastic picture was complicated by another child, Thutmose III, the son of Thutmose II by a lesser wife. This boy, while of royal blood, lacked the exalted lineage that Hatshepsut possessed. In the strict calculus of Egyptian succession, he was eligible for kingship, but his claim was weaker than that of a child born of the great royal wife. When Thutmose II died young, leaving only this infant son to succeed him, Egypt was thrown once again into uncertainty. Hatshepsut, as the great royal widow and stepmother to the young Thutmose III, stepped forward as regent, ostensibly ruling on his behalf until he came of age. Yet even from the beginning, her regency carried an unmistakable air of authority. She was no passive caretaker. She issued decrees, supervised monumental construction projects, and presided over court ceremonies with all the trappings of royal command. She carefully presented herself as the guardian of Egypt's divine order, the protector of the two lands during a time of vulnerable transition. Her stewardship of Thutmose III was both a political necessity and a calculated move. By positioning herself as his regent and mentor, Hatshepsut gained the loyalty of the court and the priesthood, ensuring that no rival faction could easily challenge her authority. At the same time, she subtly began to blur the lines between regent and ruler. In official depictions, she was increasingly shown performing royal functions in her own right, sometimes with Thutmose III absent or relegated to a minor role. Through these early years of regency, Hatshepsut demonstrated a masterful understanding of power. She did not seize the throne through force or decree. She allowed the circumstances, the death of her husband, the youth of her stepson, the need for stability, to create a vacuum that she could naturally fill. She built alliances with key figures in the army and priesthood, ensured the loyalty of powerful administrators, and wrapped her authority in the sacred mantle of Ammonius' blessing. It was during this period that she began to lay the ideological groundwork for what would eventually become her unprecedented kingship. She commissioned inscriptions that emphasized her divine birth and favor from the gods. She promoted her role as God's wife of Ammonius, not as a relic of her youth, but as an ongoing testament to her sacred legitimacy. She even began to cultivate a public image that fused traditional male and female symbols of power, preparing the people for the moment when she would no longer rule for Thutmose III, but in her own name. The complexities of Hatshepsut's role as queen, stepmother, and regent reveal a woman who understood that power was not seized in a moment. It was built patiently, stone by stone, until it became an unassailable monument. Her marriage to Thutmose II may have been arranged for dynastic reasons, but through it, she gained the platform from which she would later launch her revolutionary reign. Her stewardship of young Thutmose III was not a betrayal of the boy king, but a necessary measure to ensure the continuity and stability of Egypt during a vulnerable transition. Through it all, Hatshepsut remained keenly aware that her authority, however justified by circumstance or piety, defied centuries of tradition. She had to be more than capable, she had to be indispensable. And so, with the patience of a master strategist, she prepared the court, the temples, and the people for the day when a woman would not merely serve the king, but become one. The death of Thutmose II marked a pivotal crisis in the Egyptian court, a moment charged with uncertainty and danger. Egypt had always depended on the steady hand of its pharaohs, believing that the health of the two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt, was tied directly to the strength of the king. When a ruler died without a clear and capable successor, the very order of the world risked unraveling. Now the court faced a situation that threatened to unbalance the sacred symmetry. An infant heir, Thutmose III, too young to rule in his own right, and a kingdom that needed immediate leadership. The passing of Thutmose II left a vacuum that nature and politics abhorred. Rival factions within the court, generals, provincial governors, and priesthoods, all saw an opportunity to exert influence over the vulnerable state. The death of a pharaoh could lead to rapid shifts in alliances, to the rise of opportunists who might try to seize power for themselves. It was a moment ripe for chaos, and one that demanded swift, decisive action. Into this dangerous uncertainty stepped Hatshepsut. As the great royal wife, she was uniquely positioned to act. She was the widow of the deceased king, the mother of the royal bloodline through her daughter Neferur, and the stepmother of the infant king Thutmose III. More importantly, she had spent years building the religious and political capital necessary to act not merely as a caretaker, but as a true guardian of Egypt's destiny. Her first moves after Thutmose II's death reveal the shrewdness of a political master. Rather than immediately declaring herself ruler, she positioned herself as the regent, a familiar, acceptable role for a royal woman. In this capacity, she claimed to act only in the best interests of the infant king, protecting the throne until he was ready to assume full power. This public posture calmed potential opposition, reassuring the court that the sacred line of kingship remained intact. At the same time, however, Hatshepsut moved decisively to consolidate her authority. She took control of the royal court's functioning, ensuring that all edicts, ceremonies, and decisions passed through her hands. She strengthened her ties to the priesthood, particularly the powerful clergy of Ammonius at Karnak, whose support could legitimize or destroy any claim to power. She also cultivated the loyalty of key officials, men whose influence extended deep into Egypt's administrative and military apparatus. One such figure was Senenmut, a man of humble origins who rose through the ranks to become one of Hatshepsut's most trusted advisors. His meteoric rise mirrored Hatshepsut's own unconventional path to power, and he became indispensable to her rule. Senenmut oversaw major building projects, managed temple wealth, and acted as an intermediary between the queen regent and various factions at court. His loyalty and skill provided Hatshepsut with a vital ally in navigating the treacherous waters of royal politics. The alliance between Hatshepsut and the religious establishment was particularly crucial. By strengthening ties with the priesthood of Ammonius, she not only gained political support but also grounded her authority in divine sanction. Egypt's entire worldview was based on the belief that pharaohs ruled as the gods' representatives on earth. Thus, winning the blessing of Ammonius' priests meant more than securing clerical approval. It meant embodying cosmic legitimacy. Gradually, subtly, Hatshepsut began to shift her image from that of regent to something far more ambitious. She began to adopt additional titles, each layering another aspect of authority onto her public persona. She was no longer simply the caretaker of the throne. She became the king's principal wife, the foremost of noble women, and eventually began to hint at her own sovereign role. This transition was not abrupt. It was masterfully staged over time, allowing the court and the public to adjust to her expanding power without triggering immediate backlash. Each new title, each new depiction of her in temple art, nudged Egypt closer to accepting an extraordinary reality: that a woman could rule not merely in the name of a king, but as king in her own right. A critical element of this transformation was Hatshepsut's public claim to divine birth. In a series of inscriptions and temple reliefs, she proclaimed that her father was not merely Thutmose I, but Ammonius himself. According to this narrative, Ammonius had come to her mother, Queen Ahmose, in the form of Thutmose I, ensuring that Hatshepsut was conceived through divine intervention. This mythic lineage elevated her status beyond that of any mortal competitor. She was not simply royal by blood. She was divine by nature, chosen by the gods to rule. This assertion of divine birth was no mere vanity. It was a calculated political strategy. By linking herself directly to the god of gods, she made her rule unassailable within the religious framework of Egyptian society. If Ammonius himself had fathered her, then questioning her right to rule was tantamount to blasphemy. It was a masterstroke that few male pharaohs had attempted so boldly, and one that wrapped her political ambitions in an unbreakable veil of sacred authority. The culmination of this gradual accumulation of power came in a dramatic and unprecedented event: Hatshepsut's coronation as Pharaoh of Egypt. Not as queen or regent, but as king. The ceremonies that surrounded her enthronement followed the traditional rites reserved for male rulers. She underwent the rituals of purification, was anointed with sacred oils, and received the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt. Her coronation inscriptions carefully presented her elevation not as a rebellion or usurpation, but as the fulfillment of a divine plan. In taking the full title and regalia of kingship, Hatshepsut shattered centuries of tradition. Pharaoh was a male role, tied intrinsically to the masculine ideals of strength, virility, and martial prowess. A woman occupying the throne as king, not merely as queen, was almost unthinkable. Yet Hatshepsut made it reality, and she did so by appropriating the symbols and language of male authority while subtly redefining them. One of the most striking elements of her kingship was her adoption of male regalia. In public monuments and temple carvings, Hatshepsut was depicted wearing the traditional kilt, the Nemes headdress, and most iconically, the false beard associated with the pharaohs. These images were not intended to deceive the public into thinking she was a man. Rather, they signaled that she possessed the full powers and responsibilities of kingship. In the deeply symbolic visual language of ancient Egypt, the beard and kilt were markers of office, not indicators of biological sex. By donning them, Hatshepsut asserted that she was pharaoh in the truest, most sacred sense. This blending of masculine symbolism with feminine identity was revolutionary. In temple inscriptions, she often referred to herself using masculine titles, yet she did not erase her womanhood. In some texts, she acknowledged her female nature even as she claimed the role of son of Re, the title traditionally held by male rulers. Through this delicate balancing act, she carved out a new space within Egyptian ideology, a space where a woman could embody kingship without contradiction. At the heart of her success was the political genius of presenting herself as both daughter and chosen heir of Ammonius. This claim allowed her to transcend the gender norms that would have otherwise barred her from the throne. She was not just Hatshepsut, daughter of Thutmose I and Queen Ahmose. She was the living embodiment of divine will. In an age when the pharaoh was viewed as a god incarnate, this assertion made her kingship not only acceptable but inevitable. Throughout her reign, Hatshepsut carefully maintained the balance she had crafted during her ascent to power. She honored Thutmose III, presenting herself as his guardian and co-ruler, thereby maintaining the illusion of dynastic continuity. Yet in practice, she ruled with full sovereign authority, commissioning grand building projects, leading trade expeditions, and overseeing a flourishing period of peace and prosperity. Her rise from regent to king was not simply a personal triumph. It was a testament to her profound understanding of Egypt's religious and political structures. She did not overthrow tradition, she rewrote it, embedding her rule so deeply within Egypt's ideological framework that it became part of the divine order itself. In this way, Hatshepsut achieved what few rulers in history have managed: the transformation of society's most fundamental assumptions. She demonstrated that power need not be confined by gender, that legitimacy could be reimagined, and that the will of the gods could manifest in unexpected forms. Her ascent to kingship was not a coup or a whim of fate. It was the culmination of a lifetime of preparation, strategy, and unparalleled vision. The death of Thutmose II, which could have plunged Egypt into chaos, instead set the stage for one of the most extraordinary reigns in ancient history. In the vacuum left by his passing, Hatshepsut did not simply survive. She flourished, reshaping Egypt and leaving a legacy that would echo across millennia. Once Hatshepsut had secured her position as pharaoh, she understood that wielding real power was not enough. She needed to shape how that power was perceived and remembered. The image of a king was as vital as the acts of kingship themselves. In a land where symbolism held as much weight as reality, where the divine right of kings was rooted not only in ritual, but in the visual and narrative structures surrounding the monarchy, Hatshepsut set about constructing an identity that would reinforce her rule in the minds of her people for generations to come. She launched one of the most ambitious and sophisticated propaganda campaigns in the history of ancient Egypt. Everywhere the eye could turn, in temples, in public spaces, in the heart of the religious world, there would be images and inscriptions celebrating her kingship. No detail was too small, no effort too great in the quest to normalize and glorify her reign. Reliefs in sacred temples depicted her not as a secondary figure or a consort, but as the legitimate and divinely sanctioned ruler of the two lands. These images presented her as the living Horus, the son of Re, the ultimate sovereign power, a position no previous woman had claimed so openly. Through masterful control of public imagery, Hatshepsut could tell a very specific story. Not only was she the rightful king, but her rule was the fulfillment of the god's will. The inscriptions emphasized her divine birth, her connection to Ammonius, and her preordained destiny. They carefully weaved a narrative that made her kingship seem not only acceptable but inevitable, as though the gods themselves had orchestrated it from the beginning of time. Her rise was not an anomaly, these images insisted. It was part of Ma'at, the cosmic order of balance and justice that governed all life in Egypt. The centerpiece of Hatshepsut's visual and ideological campaign was the grand mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, nestled beneath the cliffs on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes. This temple was unlike anything Egypt had seen before. Its sweeping terraces, elegant colonnades, and harmonious integration with the surrounding landscape created a sense of timeless majesty. Designed by her trusted architect and courtier Senenmut, Deir el-Bahri was both an architectural marvel and a political statement carved into stone. Every aspect of its design reinforced the message of divine kingship and eternal legacy. The temple served multiple purposes. It was a place of worship, a mortuary complex for her cult after death, and most importantly, a living monument to her reign. Across its expansive walls, a series of reliefs told the carefully curated story of her life and accomplishments. These included her divine conception, her coronation, her celebrated expedition to the land of Punt, and her close relationship with the god Ammonius. Each scene was rich in detail and symbolism, crafted to educate, impress, and inspire all who visited. The journey to Punt, in particular, became one of the temple's most iconic narratives. This trading expedition, which brought back incense, exotic animals, gold, and rare plants, was presented not merely as a political or economic success, but as a fulfillment of divine favor. It portrayed Hatshepsut as a bringer of abundance and prosperity, a ruler whose connection to the gods resulted in tangible blessings for her people. Such stories reinforced the perception that her reign was a golden age of peace, wealth, and divine harmony. One of the most remarkable features of Hatshepsut's artistic program was the deliberate blending of male and female elements in her representation. In statues, she was sometimes depicted wearing the traditional male pharaoh's attire: the Neem's headdress, the false beard, the Shendit kilt. Yet there were also instances where she was shown with a slender, feminine form, subtly acknowledging her womanhood even as she embraced the masculine role of king. This duality was not a contradiction, but a carefully crafted statement. Hatshepsut was not pretending to be a man. She was expanding the definition of kingship itself to include her as she was. In some depictions, the inscriptions accompanying her statues and reliefs used masculine pronouns and titles, reinforcing her identity as king. In others, feminine grammar appeared, creating a layered portrait that allowed her to be understood both as a woman and as a sovereign. This fluid approach to gender representation was unprecedented and speaks to the complexity of her self-presentation. She inhabited the role of king without denying her origins, creating a new archetype that was neither entirely male nor entirely female, but something uniquely powerful. The statues themselves ranged from colossal seated figures to graceful standing poses, each crafted with exquisite skill. Some were idealized, presenting her as the perfect, youthful king. Others leaned into realism, showing the signs of age and experience. This variation allowed different audiences to connect with different aspects of her persona. To the priests and officials, she appeared as the strong, eternal ruler. To the common people, perhaps as a more relatable, mortal leader blessed by the gods. By controlling how she was portrayed, Hatshepsut controlled how she would be understood. Art in ancient Egypt was not about realism. It was about idealism, about expressing eternal truths rather than momentary appearances. Hatshepsut's artistic program took full advantage of this tradition. She crafted a timeless identity that transcended the immediate circumstances of her reign, planting the seeds of a legacy that would endure far beyond her lifetime. In addition to visual imagery, narrative inscriptions played a crucial role in shaping public perception. These texts did not merely record events, they interpreted them, placing them within a divine framework that justified and celebrated her rule. They proclaimed her legitimacy, her piety, her successes, and her indispensability to Egypt's continued well-being. They narrated a version of history that placed her firmly at the center of a grand, God-ordained destiny. Through these inscriptions, Hatshepsut linked her reign to the great kings of the past, particularly her father, Thutmose I, whom she presented as her primary source of legitimacy. She emphasized that it was he who had recognized her worth and had chosen her as his successor, even if circumstances had required her initial regency on behalf of Thutmose III. By portraying herself as the true heir of Thutmose I, She bypassed the usual barriers of gender and reinforced her claim to the throne. Her relationship with Ammonius was perhaps the most critical pillar of her narrative strategy. Ammonius, the king of the gods, was shown not only as her father but as her constant guide and supporter. Temples and inscriptions celebrated her as Ammonius' beloved, the one he had personally selected to maintain Ma'at on earth. In a society where divine favor was essential to legitimacy, this connection made her rule unassailable in spiritual terms. Yet despite the overwhelming scale and sophistication of her image-building campaign, Hatshepsut remained acutely aware of the delicate balance she had to maintain. She never formally disinherited Thutmose III, nor did she erase his existence from official records. Instead, she presented her reign as a joint guardianship, a period of stewardship until the young king was ready. In this way, she mitigated potential resentment and opposition, positioning herself not as a usurper, but as a protector of dynastic continuity. In the eyes of her contemporaries, this image-building campaign appears to have succeeded. There is little evidence of widespread unrest or rebellion during her reign. The sheer volume of temples, statues, obelisks, and inscriptions celebrating her achievements suggests that she enjoyed broad acceptance, at least among the elites who controlled Egypt's political and religious life. Her ability to maintain peace and prosperity, to expand Egypt's wealth through trade rather than war, and to secure the favor of the gods would have been seen as proof of her right to rule. However, the very need for such an elaborate propaganda machine hints at the underlying fragility of her position. Hatshepsut's rule was extraordinary, but it remained an exception within Egypt's long history of male kingship. She had to work continuously to reinforce and defend her authority, to preempt and counteract the natural biases of a deeply patriarchal society. Her visual and narrative strategies were not mere vanity. They were acts of political survival as much as celebrations of achievement. Her efforts to build the image of a king succeeded brilliantly during her lifetime. She carved her story into the very stone of Egypt's sacred spaces, embedding her reign into the fabric of religious and national identity. Yet the memory of her rule would later come under attack, suggesting that even the most masterful propaganda has limits when faced with changing political tides. Nonetheless, the sheer audacity and brilliance of Hatshepsut's image-making endure as a testament to her vision, her intelligence, and her profound understanding of the power of narrative in shaping reality. Through art, architecture, and the written word, she remade herself into something timeless. A woman who was a king, a mortal who was divine, a ruler who challenged the boundaries of tradition and reshaped the possibilities of history itself. Her legacy remains etched into the stone of Egypt and the imagination of the world, a lasting reminder of how power, once seized, can be immortalized through the mastery of image and story. With the throne firmly in her grasp and her image as king deeply rooted in the consciousness of her people, Hatshepsut turned her attention towards strengthening the foundation of Egypt itself. Her reign, unlike many that came before or after, would be remembered not for the clash of swords, but for the clinking of gold, the scent of incense, and the hum of bustling markets. The years under her rule blossomed into an era of unparalleled peace and prosperity, a time when Egypt extended its influence not through conquest, but through trade, diplomacy, and the steady weaving of alliances that stretched across deserts, mountains, and seas. The years before Hatshepsut's reign had seen Egypt rattled by internal divisions and external threats. Trade routes that had once flowed freely, bringing riches and exotic goods into the Nile Valley, had been disrupted or entirely severed during periods of instability. Re-establishing these lifelines was vital, not just for the material wealth they would bring, but for the prestige and vitality of her kingship. Recognizing this, Hatshepsut set her sights beyond Egypt's borders, determined to knit her realm back into the broader tapestry of the ancient world's economic networks. One of her most celebrated achievements was the reopening of Egypt's trade with the mysterious and fabled land of Punt, a region believed to lie somewhere along the Horn of Africa, perhaps in modern-day Eritrea or Somalia. The expedition to Punt was a masterstroke of ambition and vision. Detailed reliefs carved into the walls of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri vividly depict the journey. Sleek ships laden with goods, sailors navigating foreign waters, and ambassadors greeting the exotic rulers of Punt. The scenes are alive with detail, showing the beehive-shaped houses of the Puntites, the exotic animals they reared, and the strange trees that grew in their fertile lands. The bounty brought back from Punt was astounding. gold, myrrh, frankincense, precious woods, ebony, ivory, exotic animals like baboons and panthers, and even living myrrh trees, carefully transported and planted in the gardens of Karnak Temple. These treasures were not mere curiosities. They held deep symbolic and religious significance, especially the incense, which played a vital role in temple rituals and offerings to the gods. By bringing Punt's riches back to Egypt, Hatshepsut was fulfilling her role as a provider of ma'at, cosmic order and abundance, not just for her people but for the gods themselves. This expedition was more than a commercial venture. It was a diplomatic masterpiece. It reasserted Egypt's presence on the international stage and sent a clear message. Under Hatshepsut's reign, Egypt was once again a dominant and respected power. The voyage to Punt was mythologized almost immediately, folded into the narrative of divine favor that surrounded her kingship. Reliefs in her temple show that it was Ammonius himself who commanded the journey, reinforcing the idea that every success during her reign was the will of the gods, executed through their chosen ruler. Trade was not the only diplomatic tool Hatshepsut employed to weave a fabric of stability and prosperity. Diplomatic marriages, alliances with neighboring powers, and careful negotiations helped secure Egypt's borders without the need for costly wars. Marriages between Egyptian princesses and foreign rulers, though common in earlier and later periods, were part of the broader diplomatic dance, sealing treaties and ensuring loyalty through blood ties. Although there is less direct evidence of Hatshepsut's own daughters being married off for political gain, the wider practice of marriage diplomacy certainly continued during her rule, helping to maintain a balance of power favorable to Egypt. The fruits of these peaceful policies were seen in the thriving cities, the full granaries, the vibrant art, and the grand construction projects that dotted the Nile Valley. Egypt under Hatshepsut was a land of wealth and renewal, where artisans, merchants, and priests alike benefited from the stability she so carefully cultivated. Grain from the fertile fields of the Delta, gold from Nubia, incense from Punt, and lapis lazuli from Afghanistan poured into the temples and treasuries, enriching not only the royal court but the broader religious and civic institutions of the kingdom. This era of prosperity was not an accident. It was the product of deliberate, visionary leadership. Hatshepsut understood that a thriving economy reinforced the legitimacy of the crown. Every full storehouse, every successful trade caravan, every gilded statue erected in a temple was a testament to her right to rule. Peace, wealth, and divine favor were inseparable in the Egyptian mind, and Hatshepsut's reign was a golden thread woven seamlessly into the fabric of Ma'at itself. Yet economic and diplomatic success were only one pillar of her enduring legacy. Equally critical was her profound devotion to the gods, particularly Ammonius, and the religious innovations that both strengthened her rule and reshaped Egypt's spiritual landscape. Religious devotion in ancient Egypt was not a private affair. It was a public performance, a political necessity, and a cornerstone of kingship. Hatshepsut embraced this with a fervor and creativity that few rulers could match. She understood that divine favor was the ultimate source of legitimacy, and that the gods' visible blessing of her reign would silence those who might otherwise question a female king. Her contributions to Egypt's religious life were monumental, both literally and metaphorically. Chief among her projects was the expansion and embellishment of the great temple of Ammonius at Karnak. This sprawling complex had already been a center of religious life for centuries, but under Hatshepsut, it was transformed into a glittering testament to divine and royal power. She commissioned the erection of towering obelisks, each carved from a single piece of granite and gilded at their tips, so that they blazed like beacons in the sunlight. These obelisks proclaimed her devotion to Ammonius and her gratitude for his favor, soaring skyward as bridges between the mortal and the divine. One of her most famous obelisks, erected at Karnak, bore inscriptions that made no effort to disguise her gender, but instead emphasized her unique role as the god's chosen vessel. She recorded her achievements proudly, declaring that she had built her monuments not for personal glory, but to honor the god who had placed her on the throne. Through such acts, she wrapped her reign in the language of piety, portraying herself as a humble servant of the divine rather than an ambitious usurper. Hatshepsut took her religious devotion a step further by encouraging her own deification during her lifetime. She presented herself not just as the favored of the gods, but as semi-divine herself, the literal daughter of Ammonius. Reliefs in her mortuary temple depict the god Ammonius visiting her mother, Queen Ahmose, in the guise of Thutmose III, thereby siring Hatshepsut through divine union. This myth of divine birth was more than a charming fable. It was a powerful political tool. If she was the daughter of a god, then her rule was beyond mortal challenge. Ceremonies and festivals under Hatshepsut's rule reflected and reinforced this divine connection. Grand processions, temple rituals, and offerings to the gods emphasized the king's role as the intermediary between heaven and earth. One notable festival, the beautiful Festival of the Valley, celebrated the link between the living and the dead, the gods and their mortal representatives. Hatshepsut's participation in such festivals, depicted with meticulous care in temple reliefs, showed her fulfilling her sacred duties with grace and devotion. Religious reform and innovation also marked her reign. She revitalized ancient rituals, restored neglected temples, and established new cults where necessary to strengthen the ideological framework supporting her kingship. These actions were not merely acts of piety, but calculated moves to ensure the loyalty of the priesthood, particularly that of Ammonius, which was among the most powerful institutions in Egypt. By lavishing the temples with gifts, land, and new construction, she bound the priests' interests to her own, creating a mutual dependency that fortified her rule. Her relationship with the priesthood was crucial. The priests of Ammonius held immense political sway, capable of bolstering or undermining a pharaoh's reign. Hatshepsut's generosity toward them ensured their support, and in return, they sanctified her kingship through ritual and proclamation. This alliance between throne and temple created a self-reinforcing cycle. Her successes were proof of divine favor, which justified her reign, which in turn deepened the devotion of the religious establishment. In the public sphere, this blending of royal and religious imagery served to saturate everyday life with the idea that Hatshepsut's rule was both natural and sacred. Ordinary Egyptians, visiting temples or witnessing festivals, would see not only the grandeur of their state, but the hand of the gods at work through their king. In such a worldview, questioning Hatshepsut's authority would be akin to questioning the gods themselves, a dangerous and unthinkable act. Thus, through diplomacy and trade, through religious devotion and innovation, Hatshepsut crafted a reign of dazzling prosperity and spiritual renewal. She wove her authority into every facet of life, from the goods exchanged in bustling markets to the prayers whispered in the shadowed halls of sacred temples. Her leadership brought Egypt not only material wealth, but a profound sense of divine harmony, a rebirth of national pride and cosmic balance after years of uncertainty. By the time her reign reached its zenith, Hatshepsut had accomplished what few rulers, male or female, could claim. She had created an Egypt where peace was not a lull between wars but a way of life, where the gods smiled upon the land, and where the memory of her greatness seemed destined to echo through the ages. The foundations she laid in trade, diplomacy, religious innovation, and public works would outlast her lifetime, enduring as monuments to a reign that transformed Egypt's destiny and redefined the very meaning of kingship itself. In the midst of her monumental achievements in governance, diplomacy, and religious innovation, Hatshepsut's personal life and the complex dynamics of her inner circle played an equally crucial role in shaping the narrative of her reign. Behind the stone monuments, grand temples, and gilded obelisks, a world of personal loyalties, ambitions, quiet alliances, and simmering tensions unfolded. A world that reveals as much about Hatshepsut's strength and vulnerabilities as her public image does. Among the figures who stood closest to Hatshepsut, none looms larger or more enigmatically than Senenmut. His rise from modest origins to become one of the most powerful and visible officials in Egypt speaks volumes about both his personal talents and Hatshepsut's capacity to recognize and reward loyalty. Senenmut held a staggering number of titles, over 80, including steward of the god's wife, overseer of works, and tutor to the king's daughter. His responsibilities ranged from supervising royal building projects to managing temple estates, roles that placed him at the very heart of Hatshepsut's administration. The depth of trust Hatshepsut placed in Senenmut is evident in the sheer scope of his influence. He was granted the rare privilege of dedicating his own mortuary chapel within the sacred precinct of Deir el-Bahri, an honor typically reserved for royalty or the highest echelons of the priesthood. In the statues and inscriptions that survive, Senenmut is often depicted in close proximity to Princess Neferur, Hatshepsut's daughter, whom he served as tutor and protector. Some scholars have speculated that the bond between Hatshepsut and Senenmut may have extended beyond the political or professional into the personal and even romantic, though concrete evidence remains elusive. Certain graffiti, now faded by time, hint at the possibility of a more intimate relationship, but whether these were expressions of court gossip, satirical attacks, or glimpses of truth remains a matter of debate. Regardless of the true nature of their relationship, it is undeniable that Senenmut was a linchpin of Hatshepsut's rule. His loyalty was unwavering, his competence unmatched, and his proximity to power a constant source of both envy and suspicion among other courtiers. In a court rife with traditionalists who might have bristled at the idea of a woman ruling as king, Senenmut's visible support provided Hatshepsut with a crucial buffer against internal dissent. Parallel to her reliance on trusted officials like Senenmut, Hatshepsut also invested deeply in grooming her daughter Neferur for a role of political prominence. From an early age, Neferur was endowed with significant religious and ceremonial responsibilities, often depicted in royal iconography with attributes associated with pharaohs and high priestesses. She held the prestigious title of God's wife of Ammonius, a position that combined immense religious authority with substantial political clout. It is tempting to see in Neferur the outline of Hatshepsut's broader ambitions, a continuation of her own unprecedented reign through a new female leader. Some scholars have suggested that Hatshepsut may have envisioned Neferur as her successor, a queen regnant in her own right who would solidify the new possibilities Hatshepsut herself had carved into the stone of history. Yet Neferur's fate remains shrouded in mystery. At some point during Hatshepsut's reign, she disappears from the historical record, her death or removal from public life unrecorded by the chroniclers of the time. Whether by illness, political intrigue, or other forces, Neferur's absence left a void that would eventually be filled by the male heir, Thutmose III. Within the glittering, scheming world of the royal court, alliances were fluid, loyalties conditional, and rivalries inevitable. Hatshepsut's supporters were drawn from a range of backgrounds. Ambitious officials like Senenmut, powerful priests whose wealth and influence had been bolstered by her temple-building programs, and members of the old nobility who saw in her reign a continuation of stability rather than chaos. Yet opposition also lurked in the shadows. Traditionalists who clung to the idea of male kingship, factions loyal to Thutmose III's claim, and those who simply coveted power for themselves all existed within the very heart of Hatshepsut's administration. Managing this complex web of loyalties required not only political shrewdness, but also a careful balancing of patronage, religious legitimization, and personal charisma. Hatshepsut's ability to maintain her rule in such an environment speaks volumes about her extraordinary skill as a politician and strategist. Yet even as she built her empire of stone and order, another force was growing quietly in the background, a force that would one day challenge the legacy she had so meticulously crafted. Thutmose III, the boy king whom Hatshepsut had sidelined but not discarded, was coming of age. When Hatshepsut first assumed the role of regent, Thutmose III had been a mere child, too young to rule independently and too easily manipulated by those who might have used him as a puppet. By stepping into the role of king herself, Hatshepsut effectively shielded Egypt from a potentially dangerous power struggle. Yet as the years passed and Thutmose III grew into manhood, the question of succession loomed ever larger. Thutmose III's upbringing during Hatshepsut's reign remains a subject of much historical intrigue. Far from being hidden away or mistreated, he received the training and education befitting a future pharaoh. He was schooled in the arts of governance, the rituals of religion, and, most importantly, the skills of war. His early career was marked by military appointments, including the prestigious position of commander of the army, a role that gave him both experience and a loyal following among the military elite. It is clear that Hatshepsut was walking a delicate tightrope. On the one hand, she needed to maintain her own authority and prevent any premature attempts by Thutmose III's supporters to assert his rule. On the other hand, she had to prepare him for eventual kingship, ensuring that when the time came, he would be capable of leading Egypt effectively. This dual approach, sidelining him from immediate power while grooming him for future leadership, reflects the pragmatic complexity of Hatshepsut's political mind. However, tensions inevitably simmered beneath the surface. Thutmose III's growing popularity among certain factions of the court, particularly the military, posed a latent threat to Hatshepsut's regime. His supporters, eager to see their prince ascend the throne in full, may have chafed at his prolonged subordination. Whether Thutmose III himself harbored resentment toward Hatshepsut during these years is a matter of speculation. The later erasure of Hatshepsut's name from many monuments, an act likely ordered during Thutmose III's reign, suggests that if not in his youth, then certainly later, He or his advisors viewed her reign as an uncomfortable and inconvenient chapter in Egypt's royal narrative. Nonetheless, there is little evidence of outright rebellion or open hostility during Hatshepsut's lifetime. Thutmose III appears to have fulfilled his roles dutifully, participating in official ceremonies and maintaining a public face of loyalty. This uneasy coexistence was perhaps sustained by the mutual understanding that each benefited from the other's stability. Hatshepsut needed the legitimacy of the royal line embodied by Thutmose III, while Thutmose III needed the political order maintained by Hatshepsut to ensure that his eventual succession would not be tainted by chaos. Throughout this period, the court would have been a place of whispered intrigues, calculated displays of loyalty, and subtle jockeying for position. Officials would have had to navigate the treacherous waters of favor and suspicion, aligning themselves carefully either with Hatshepsut's established power or with the rising star of Thutmose III. In such an environment, even minor missteps could be fatal, while acts of prescient loyalty could secure fortunes for generations. As Thutmose III matured, the inevitability of his full kingship drew nearer. Hatshepsut, perhaps recognizing the limits of her mortality and the need for a stable succession, appears to have gradually begun preparing the way for a transition. Yet she remained firmly in control until the end of her life, ensuring that her vision for Egypt, one of divine order, prosperity, and monumental legacy, would not be undone by premature shifts in power. When Hatshepsut finally passed from the scene, Thutmose III stepped fully into the role of sole ruler, embarking on a reign that would be marked by military conquest and administrative vigor. Yet even as he carved his own legacy into the sands of history, the ghost of Hatshepsut's reign would linger. A reminder of a time when Egypt was ruled not by the sword, but by the pen, the temple, and the steady hand of a woman who had dared to redefine what it meant to be king. Behind the towering obelisks, monumental temples, and grand diplomatic feats of Hatshepsut's reign lies a subtler, more human story. A world where personal relationships, whispered court intrigues, unspoken alliances, and calculated maneuvers played as crucial a role as any decree carved into stone. At the center of this quieter drama was a woman who, while she wore the regalia of a king and bore the titles of a god's chosen, remained deeply embedded in the complex web of human relationships that defined life at the Egyptian court. One figure who shines particularly brightly against this backdrop is Senenmut, the architect, official, and trusted confidant whose career rose in tandem with Hatshepsut's ascent to power. Coming from non-royal, relatively humble origins, Senenmut's meteoric rise is itself remarkable, but it is the nature of his bond with Hatshepsut that has fascinated historians and storytellers across centuries. Holding over 80 titles, Senenmut commanded not only administrative and architectural domains, but also wielded significant personal influence, a rare combination for any courtier, let alone one who had no royal blood. Senenmut's proximity to Hatshepsut was unprecedented. He was entrusted with supervising the construction of her most important monuments, including the magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri. Even more telling was his role as tutor and guardian to Neferur, Hatshepsut's daughter, a position that brought him into intimate daily contact with the royal family. The statues that survive from this period often depict Senenmut cradling the young princess protectively, an imagery that goes beyond mere professionalism and speaks to deep personal trust. This closeness has led to speculation about whether their bond extended into the realm of romance. Ancient graffiti discovered near Deir el-Bahri, suggestive and even body in nature, hint at such a relationship, but no official inscription confirms it. Whether these were the product of malicious rumor, political slander, or glimpses of reality remains uncertain. What is clear, however, is that their relationship, whether romantic or purely strategic, was one of exceptional loyalty. Senenmut's career, his honors, and his unprecedented privileges testify to a bond that was among the most powerful partnerships of Hatshepsut's reign. Parallel to this relationship was Hatshepsut's effort to position her daughter, Neferur, for a significant political role. As the sole child of the royal house after the death of her father, Thutmose II, Neferur held tremendous symbolic importance. Hatshepsut carefully groomed her for leadership, investing her with religious titles and depicting her in roles traditionally reserved for kings or high priests. In temple reliefs and inscriptions, Neferur is shown participating in rituals that underlined her centrality to the royal narrative. This grooming had a clear purpose. With no strong male heir immediately available, Hatshepsut may have envisioned a future where Neferur would step into a position of substantial, if not ultimate, authority. By weaving Neferur into the religious and political fabric of Egypt from a young age, Hatshepsut attempted to solidify the acceptance of female leadership beyond her own reign. Tragically, Neferur's story vanishes from the record during Hatshepsut's later years. Whether through illness, political machinations, or other causes, her disappearance left a vacuum that would eventually contribute to the shifting balance of power at court. Within the court itself, Hatshepsut faced an environment of cautious support, passive opposition, and quiet rivalry. Her rule was unprecedented. No woman before her had claimed kingship so boldly or so successfully. As a result, while she was supported by a loyal circle, including key priests, administrators like Senenmut, and military officials who benefited from the prosperity she cultivated, there were undoubtedly factions that viewed her reign with skepticism or resentment. Traditionalists who clung to the belief that kingship was the domain of men likely bristled at her assumption of power. Courtiers connected to Thutmose III's lineage must have eyed the future with mixed feelings, balancing their loyalty to the reigning monarch with quiet hopes for the restoration of male rule. Managing these undercurrents required Hatshepsut's constant vigilance and deft political hand. She leveraged religious legitimacy, building strong alliances with the powerful priesthood of Ammonius, and used art and architecture to shape public perception of her reign. Nonetheless, tension lingered, a subtle pressure beneath the glittering facade of stability and grandeur. All the while, growing in the background was Thutmose III, the rightful heir according to tradition, a child king overshadowed by the brilliance and ambition of his stepmother. When Hatshepsut had first assumed the regency, Thutmose III was too young to rule independently, and it was likely recognized by all that Egypt needed a strong hand to guide it through potential instability. Her rise to power was in part a measure to protect the state, but as time passed and Hatshepsut transitioned from regent to king, the question of Thutmose III's future became increasingly complicated. During Hatshepsut's reign, Thutmose III was not imprisoned or hidden away. Instead, he was given a thorough royal education, trained in military tactics, governance, religious ceremonies, and administrative management. His appointment as commander of Egypt's armies during Hatshepsut's later years indicates a clear effort to prepare him for leadership while keeping him occupied in ways that channeled his ambitions productively. Still, his position was deeply paradoxical. Nominally king alongside Hatshepsut, but practically sidelined, with little actual influence in courtly decisions. The degree to which Thutmose III accepted this arrangement remains a matter of speculation. Perhaps in his youth he recognized the wisdom of Hatshepsut's stewardship, or perhaps he seethed quietly, nursing ambitions that could not yet be realized. What is certain is that factions loyal to him existed at court, composed of military officials, noble families, and others who viewed his eventual ascension as inevitable and desirable. These individuals would have had to tread carefully, balancing their support for the living ruler with their private loyalty to the rightful heir. The tension between Hatshepsut's circle and Thutmose III's growing base of supporters must have been palpable at times, though open confrontation was avoided. Hatshepsut's political genius lay in her ability to maintain the appearance of unity and order, ensuring that the transfer of power, whenever it came, would not be marred by civil strife. Even while retaining full control, she allowed Thutmose III certain honors and public visibility, a clever strategy that prevented his supporters from claiming he was being unjustly suppressed. Yet one must wonder whether Hatshepsut ever feared the growing ambitions of the young man she had once been entrusted to guide. Did she recognize in his military prowess the seeds of future conquest? Did she foresee that after her death, he would move to assert his own legacy with such force that her own would be systematically erased from the public monuments of Egypt? The careful training Thutmose III received during Hatshepsut's reign undoubtedly contributed to his later success. When he eventually became sole ruler, he embarked on a series of military campaigns that vastly expanded Egypt's borders and brought unprecedented wealth and prestige to the kingdom. The discipline, strategic thinking, and administrative skills he displayed were not the product of accident. They were cultivated under the very regime that had once limited his power. Hatshepsut's control over Thutmose III's development thus served dual purposes. It allowed her to maintain authority during her lifetime, and it ensured that Egypt would eventually be ruled by a competent and capable monarch. In this sense, her stewardship was an act of both self-preservation and statecraft, a balancing act between personal ambition and national stability. When Hatshepsut's reign drew to a close, the transition of power to Thutmose III was surprisingly smooth. There was no record of a bloody coup, no purge of officials, no civil war. Yet in the years that followed, a campaign of systematic erasure began. Images of Hatshepsut were chiseled away, her cartouches obliterated, her monuments usurped or destroyed. Whether this was orchestrated out of personal resentment by Thutmose III, a politically calculated move to reinforce the traditional male succession, or the work of later officials seeking to sanitize the royal lineage, remains a subject of debate. What is clear, however, is that the bond between Hatshepsut and Thutmose III, however complex and layered, was a defining feature of both their lives. She had been his guardian, his teacher, his regent, and ultimately, the barrier he had to wait patiently to outlast. He had been her heir, her potential rival, and, in a way, the living symbol of the very traditions she had so magnificently rewritten. The personal, political, and emotional dimensions of their relationship echo through the centuries, offering a glimpse into the profound humanity behind the grandeur of ancient Egypt's golden age. Far from the impersonal forces of destiny and divinity portrayed in official inscriptions, the story of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III is one of ambition and restraint, loyalty and rivalry, vision and patience, a testament to the complicated, fragile, and ultimately fleeting nature of power. As the sun set on one of the most remarkable reigns in Egypt's long history, the figure of Hatshepsut began to recede into mystery. After 2 decades of stability, prosperity, and monumental achievements, her presence suddenly vanished from the historical record. There is no grand funerary inscription marking the culmination of her reign, no triumphant or tragic narrative carved in stone to tell her story's final chapter. Instead, her end is veiled in silence, leaving modern historians to puzzle over the abruptness of her disappearance. Several theories have been proposed to explain this strange vanishing act. The most straightforward explanation is that Hatshepsut died a natural death. Given that she had already ruled for more than 20 years, she would likely have been in her late 40s or early 50s, an advanced age in a time when life expectancy was far lower than today. Medical analyses of a mummy once tentatively identified as hers have suggested the presence of cancer or diabetes, conditions that could have brought about a relatively sudden death. If Hatshepsut succumbed to illness, her reign may have ended quietly, with preparations made behind the scenes for the smooth transition of power to Thutmose III. Another, more dramatic theory suggests the possibility of political removal, though there is little concrete evidence to support it. Some have speculated that a faction within the court, perhaps growing impatient or fearful as Thutmose III reached full maturity, moved to sideline Hatshepsut or hasten her departure. Yet this notion seems unlikely given the complete absence of signs of a violent overthrow. There are no records of civil unrest, no abrupt changes in administration, no purges or purges of her officials, at least not immediately following her disappearance. Instead, all indications point toward a peaceful handover of authority. Thutmose III, once sidelined, emerged fully into the light as sole ruler. His reign blossomed into one of the most illustrious periods in Egypt's imperial history, marked by military conquests and an explosion of wealth and cultural achievements. If there was any resentment harbored by Thutmose III during the long years of his co-regency or subordination, it was not manifested openly at the moment of his ascension. The transition appeared seamless, suggesting that Hatshepsut, if she did not die of natural causes, either willingly stepped aside or was removed so subtly that the change left no mark in the official records. And yet, even as her death or disappearance passed without dramatic upheaval, the memory of Hatshepsut did not rest easily. Over time, a campaign of systematic erasure unfolded, targeting the very foundations of her legacy. Her statues were smashed, defaced, or buried. Her images were chiseled out of temple walls. Her cartouches, the hieroglyphic seals that proclaimed her royal name, were carved away or replaced with those of her predecessors or successors. It was an effort not merely to remove her from power, but to remove her from memory itself. This act is known as damnatio memoriae, the deliberate obliteration of a person's memory from public consciousness. While instances of damnatio memoriae occurred in various ancient societies, the case of Hatshepsut is particularly striking because of the thoroughness and focus of the destruction. It was not a blanket assault on her entire reign, but a targeted removal of her kingship. References to her time as regent or noblewoman were sometimes allowed to remain. It was specifically her assumption of the title and regalia of king that was targeted for elimination. The destruction was methodical. In some cases, workers carefully chiseled away Hatshepsut's features from temple walls, but left the underlying structure intact, indicating that the aim was not vandalism for its own sake, but a calculated revision of history. At Deir el-Bahri, where her mortuary temple once stood as a shining testament to her divine kingship, statues were toppled and buried in ritualistic caches, as if to hide their presence rather than simply destroy them. Obelisks that she had raised to touch the heavens were partially walled off, hidden but not destroyed, suggesting a reluctance, or perhaps political calculation, about outright demolishing monuments dedicated to Ammonius, Egypt's chief deity. The question of who orchestrated this campaign and why remains a subject of considerable debate. The most obvious suspect is Thutmose III, as the direct beneficiary of her disappearance, and as the one whose reign gained an unbroken appearance of legitimacy by erasing the anomaly of a female king. He had motive. Yet the campaign against her memory did not begin immediately after her death. Evidence suggests that it began some 2 decades into Thutmose III's sole rule, indicating that if he ordered it, he did so after solidifying his own position, possibly as a means of securing the succession for his own son, Amenhotep II. It is possible that the memory of Hatshepsut as king, while tolerable during Thutmose III's early reign, became politically inconvenient when the time came to ensure an undisputed male lineage. Erasing her kingship might have been seen as necessary to bolster the traditional order and prevent challenges based on the precedent of female rule. In a society where kingship was intimately tied to divine cosmic order, the ma'at, any deviation, such as a woman ruling as Pharaoh, posed a risk to the ideological foundations of monarchy. Yet it is also possible that Thutmose III's personal motivations were more complex. If he had harbored resentment during the years of Hatshepsut's rule, he might have seen the erasure as a long-delayed act of reasserting his own authority. Alternatively, he might have been attempting to protect the image of kingship itself, not out of personal animosity, but out of concern for maintaining the perceived inviolability of royal traditions. Another theory proposes that it was not Thutmose III himself, but Amenhotep II, his successor, who spearheaded the final phases of the campaign against Hatshepsut. Amenhotep II had a vested interest in promoting an image of a stable, unbroken, male-dominated succession. By removing references to Hatshepsut's unprecedented kingship, he could more easily claim an unchallenged right to rule, untainted by the complication of a female monarch intervening between Thutmose II and Thutmose III. The destruction of Hatshepsut's memory thus reflects both political and cultural anxieties. It was not merely the erasure of a woman. It was the erasure of an alternative model of kingship that had, for 2 decades, functioned with undeniable success. By striking her from the historical record, Egypt's rulers attempted to reaffirm the narrative that kingship was and always had been a male prerogative, sanctioned by the gods and encoded in the fabric of the cosmos. The broader cultural implications of this erasure are profound. Hatshepsut's reign demonstrated that effective, even extraordinary leadership could come from outside the conventional mold. Her successes challenged deeply rooted assumptions about gender and power. The subsequent effort to erase her suggests a society both impressed and unsettled by what she had achieved. Her monuments had proclaimed a new vision of divine kingship, one that merged male and female attributes, celestial and terrestrial authority. Their destruction was a symbolic reassertion of the old order. And yet, history is a stubborn thing. Despite the determined efforts to obliterate her memory, Hatshepsut's story was not entirely lost. In modern times, archaeologists and historians, piecing together the shattered fragments of her monuments, the faint traces of her erased images, and the scattered inscriptions that survived in overlooked corners, have resurrected her legacy. In a sense, Hatshepsut triumphed once again, her achievements restored to the narrative of Egypt's grandeur. The attempt to erase Hatshepsut also serves as a reminder of the limits of political power. Monuments can be smashed, names can be chiseled away, and stories can be suppressed, but the reality of lived history remains. Hatshepsut ruled Egypt successfully for over 20 years. She built great temples, expanded trade networks, stabilized a kingdom, and left an indelible mark on her civilization. No act of damnatio memoriae could truly undo what she had accomplished. Moreover, the very attempt to erase her ultimately highlights the significance of her reign. If Hatshepsut had been an ineffective or forgettable ruler, there would have been no need for such thorough efforts to remove her from history. It is precisely because she was extraordinary that her memory posed a threat to traditional narratives. The vigor of the campaign against her is a backhanded testament to her greatness. In the end, Hatshepsut's story is one of resilience, both in her lifetime and across the millennia. She dared to transcend the boundaries of her society, to imagine a different role for herself and for women within the framework of divine kingship. Even though her contemporaries tried to bury her achievements under layers of stone and silence, the echoes of her reign have endured, whispering across the centuries. Her legacy challenges us to reconsider the narratives of history, to recognize the voices that were silenced, and to appreciate the complexity of the human stories that lie beneath the surface of ancient monuments. Hatshepsut's life, her reign, and even her erasure offer profound insights into power, memory, identity, and the enduring struggle between those who make history and those who seek to control it. In the grand sweep of Egypt's ancient saga, Hatshepsut remains one of its most luminous figures, not despite the attempt to erase her, but in many ways because of it. Her life reminds us that greatness, once achieved, is never so easily undone. She continues to inspire, not just as a builder of temples or a master of statecraft, but as a testament to the enduring power of vision, ambition, and resilience. The story of Hatshepsut did not end with the chiseling away of her name or the toppling of her statues. Although her contemporaries tried to erase her memory, history had other plans. Many centuries later, modern explorers, archaeologists, and historians would begin to uncover fragments of her hidden story, piecing together a portrait of one of Egypt's most remarkable rulers. Interest in Deir el-Bahari, the stunning mortuary temple Hatshepsut had commissioned against the cliffs of western Thebes, grew as travelers, antiquarians, and early archaeologists set their sights on Egypt's ancient wonders. Even in its ruined state, the site captured imaginations. Its terraces and colonnades hinted at a former grandeur that seemed to transcend the passage of time. European expeditions in the 19th century, fueled by a growing fascination with Egyptology, often visited Deir el-Bahari. They marveled at the reliefs and the structure, but were puzzled by inconsistencies in the inscriptions. One of the most enduring confusions stemmed from the name Motker. On the temple walls, the cartouche of Motker was visible in many places. Yet early scholars did not immediately realize that Motker and Hatshepsut were the same person. The masculine presentation of royal figures on the walls, broad-shouldered, adorned with the traditional kilt and false beard of kingship, only deepened the mystery. Many initially assumed that Motker must have been a male pharaoh whose reign had somehow been overlooked in other king lists. Adding to the puzzle was the fact that Hatshepsut's name, when it appeared, was often mutilated or replaced, rendering the narrative fragmented and confusing. Some speculated that Motker was a regent or a co-ruler, perhaps a queen acting in support of an otherwise missing king. The true identity and full significance of Hatshepsut eluded scholars for decades, hidden by the very efforts once made to erase her. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a new generation of archaeologists began more systematic excavations at Deir el-Bahari. Among them was the young British archaeologist Howard Carter, later to gain fame for his discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb. In his earlier career, Carter spent significant time working under the patronage of Egyptologist Edouard Neville, whose mission was to excavate and document the Temple of Hatshepsut in painstaking detail. Carter's involvement in the Deir el-Bahari excavations proved pivotal. As he cleared away centuries of debris, he found broken statues, shattered reliefs, and displaced fragments of inscriptions. It became increasingly clear that a great ruler had once left an indelible mark on the temple, a ruler who had undertaken vast building projects and had commanded tremendous resources. Gradually, the pieces began to fall into place. Carter and his contemporaries realized that Motker and Hatshepsut were not two separate figures, but one extraordinary woman who had ruled as king. Through careful study of the temple's remaining reliefs, a remarkable story emerged. A woman of royal blood who had, against all odds, claimed the full titles and regalia of kingship, portrayed herself in the traditional male form of a pharaoh, and justified her rule with an elaborate theological narrative connecting her directly to the god Ammonius. The discovery reshaped understandings of Egypt's history and challenged assumptions about gender, authority, and power in the ancient world. Deir el-Bahari proved to be more than just a burial site or a mortuary temple. It was the central key to rediscovering Hatshepsut's reign. The narrative reliefs along the temple walls told of her divine birth, her expeditions to the fabled land of Punt, her monumental building projects, and her devotion to the gods. The grandeur of the temple itself, with its harmonious symmetry and soaring architecture, stood as a testament to the sophistication of her reign. Without Deir el-Bahari, the memory of Hatshepsut might have remained forever buried beneath the sands of time. Yet even as scholars pieced together the broad outlines of her life, one major mystery remained unsolved: the fate of Hatshepsut's physical remains. In contrast to other pharaohs whose mummies were discovered in tombs adorned with hieroglyphs proclaiming their identities, Hatshepsut's final resting place remained unknown. KV-20, the tomb she had originally prepared for herself and her father, Thutmose I, was one of the deepest and most labyrinthine in the Valley of the Kings, but it had been thoroughly looted and damaged in antiquity. No confirmed mummy of Hatshepsut was found there, and her sarcophagus, though discovered, was empty. The absence of her mummy added another layer of intrigue to her story. Where was the woman who had ruled Egypt as king? Had her body been desecrated during the campaign of erasure against her memory? Had it been hidden away to protect it from such a fate? Or had her burial simply been lost to time and tomb robbers? The search for Hatshepsut's mummy became a tantalizing quest for Egyptologists in the 20th and early 21st centuries. Various candidates were proposed over the years, based on circumstantial evidence, but none could be definitively identified as Hatshepsut. Then in 2007 a breakthrough occurred. In a modest tomb designated KV-60, two female mummies had been discovered decades earlier. One was thought to be Hatshepsut's nurse, Sitarin, based on inscriptions found nearby. The second mummy, lying on the floor without a coffin, had long been overlooked. Some suggested it might belong to an unknown royal figure, but without inscriptions or definitive evidence, her identity remained speculative. The breakthrough came when researchers connected a small artifact found elsewhere, a wooden box inscribed with Hatshepsut's cartouche, to the search. The box, once thought to be a simple canopic box for viscera, was found to contain a tooth. DNA analysis and CT scans revealed that the tooth matched a gap in the jaw of the unidentified KV-60 mummy. The condition of the mummy, combined with the match, suggested strongly that this was, in fact, the body of Hatshepsut herself. Further forensic studies revealed fascinating details about her health and the possible causes of her death. The mummy showed signs of obesity, arthritis, and diabetes, all factors that could have contributed to a decline in health during her later years. There were indications of cancer as well, which might have been the ultimate cause of death. The forensic portrait that emerged was not one of a goddess or a mythical figure, but a very human woman who bore the marks of age, illness, and the burdens of rule. The rediscovery of Hatshepsut's mummy added a deeply personal dimension to the understanding of her life and reign. Here was not just a distant historical figure, but a living, breathing human being who had dared to step beyond the boundaries of her time. Her body, once hidden, now bore silent witness to the extraordinary journey she had undertaken, from princess to queen to king, and to the efforts that had been made, unsuccessfully, to consign her to oblivion. The convergence of archaeological, forensic, and historical research in the rediscovery of Hatshepsut's story stands as one of the great achievements of modern Egyptology. It reminds us that history is not static. It evolves as new discoveries are made and old assumptions are challenged. It also serves as a poignant reminder of the fragility of memory and the resilience of truth. No matter how determined the effort to erase her, Hatshepsut's light shines once again, illuminating not only the grandeur of ancient Egypt, but the enduring human quest to understand those who came before us. Through shattered statues, faded inscriptions, and the silent testimony of her remains, Hatshepsut continues to speak across the ages. She speaks of ambition and vision, of the possibilities of leadership beyond the confines of convention, and of the stubborn persistence of legacy. In rediscovering Hatshepsut, the modern world has not only reclaimed the story of a forgotten king, but has also gained a deeper appreciation for the complexity, richness, and humanity of ancient history. Hatshepsut's legacy is a testament to the complexity of leadership, the strength of vision, and the enduring power of defiance in the face of societal norms. In the ancient world, where women were typically relegated to secondary roles in politics and governance, Hatshepsut's ascension to the throne as a female pharaoh was nothing short of revolutionary. However, her significance goes far beyond her gender, extending into the realms of power, resilience, and identity. Reevaluating her role within the broader context of ancient history reveals how she became not just a ruler but a symbol, a figure whose story resonates with the challenges women have faced throughout history in the pursuit of leadership and respect. In ancient Egypt, the concept of kingship was bound to the gods, and the throne was traditionally passed through the male line. Hatshepsut's rise to power, initially as regent for her young stepson, Thutmose III, and later as pharaoh, defied the conventions of her time. Yet Hatshepsut's reign is marked not only by her survival, but by her extraordinary achievements in governance, trade, and architecture. Her ability to navigate a male-dominated world and assume authority in her own right speaks volumes about the nuances of female leadership in ancient times. While many ancient cultures restricted the scope of female political power, Egypt's relatively progressive stance on women's roles allowed Hatshepsut to establish herself as an exception, a female pharaoh whose accomplishments still echo through history. Hatshepsut's legacy can also be understood through the lens of female empowerment. As a leader, she demonstrated that power was not inherently gendered. Rather, it was a matter of positioning, strategic intelligence, and the will to shape one's own destiny. She transformed the notion of leadership from a patriarchal symbol into one that could be wielded by a woman. The historical narrative of Hatshepsut's reign challenges the long-standing belief that female rulers were anomalies or exceptions. Rather than taking a back seat to the power structures of her time, Hatshepsut redefined the very concept of a female ruler. Her reign stands as a profound example of what women could achieve when granted the tools of power and authority, how they could shape the destinies of nations, not just support the ambitions of men. This reevaluation of Hatshepsut's reign is of great significance in the context of modern conversations around gender, leadership, and equality. In the fields of Egyptology, her story has sparked renewed interest in understanding the roles that women played in ancient history. Hatshepsut's life and reign have become central to academic discussions surrounding gender and power dynamics in the ancient world. She challenges the traditional narratives that often minimize or ignore the contributions of women in favor of male-dominated historical accounts. For Egyptologists, Hatshepsut is a crucial figure in reassessing the roles that women played in Egypt's political and religious spheres. Her story highlights how women, though often marginalized, were capable of wielding considerable influence in ancient societies, whether as queens, priestesses, or even rulers. Hatshepsut's story has also become a rallying point for feminist discourse. Her rise to power is often invoked in modern feminist movements as a symbol of female agency and empowerment. She represents the possibility of breaking through the glass ceilings that have confined women to specific roles for millennia. In an era when female leadership was often dismissed or overlooked, Hatshepsut's reign challenges these assumptions, showing that women were just as capable of ruling empires, making critical decisions, and ensuring the prosperity of their people. Her reign continues to inspire women today, serving as a reminder of the untapped potential that exists when women are given the opportunity to lead on their own terms. It speaks to the importance of recognizing and amplifying women's voices in politics and leadership across cultures and societies. Pop culture has also embraced Hatshepsut as a symbol of empowerment and mystery. Her striking portrayal in art, including her iconic statues and reliefs, has made her an enduring figure in modern representations of ancient Egypt. She is often depicted as a figure of both strength and grace, a woman who took on the mantle of kingship and excelled at it. Her story has been adapted into books, documentaries, films, and even plays, where she is portrayed not merely as a historical figure, but as a symbol of female defiance and ambition. In these modern retellings, Hatshepsut is often used as a metaphor for overcoming adversity and challenging established norms. Her legacy is thus preserved and perpetuated not only in scholarly circles, but in popular culture, where she is viewed as a role model for women striving to break free from traditional gender roles. However, Hatshepsut's influence extends beyond gender discussions and cultural representations. Her contributions to Egyptology itself, through her architectural marvels, her diplomatic missions, and her economic policies, have left an indelible mark on the study of ancient civilizations. Her ambitious building projects, such as the Temple of Deir el-Bahari, stand as enduring symbols of Egypt's artistic and architectural achievements. These works are not merely reflections of her power, but embody her complex relationship with religion, politics, and legacy. The architectural grandeur of her monuments was intended to solidify her reign, ensuring her place in history not just as a ruler, but as a divine entity in the Egyptian pantheon. In this sense, her architectural legacy is inseparable from her political and religious innovations, and her reign is often regarded as a golden age of Egyptian prosperity. In reflecting on Hatshepsut's legacy, one must consider her audacity, vision, and brilliance. Her decision to assume the role of pharaoh in an era when such a move was unprecedented for a woman was a courageous one, rooted in a deep sense of belief in her right to rule. Her actions were not simply motivated by a desire for personal power. They were driven by a genuine vision of prosperity for Egypt. She sought to strengthen her nation through military, economic, and religious reforms, and her success in these areas is a testament to her extraordinary leadership abilities. Hatshepsut's reign was not marked by violence or turmoil, but by peace and prosperity. Her vision of Egypt as a stable, thriving empire allowed her people to flourish, and her diplomatic successes, including the famous expedition to the land of Punt, expanded Egypt's wealth and influence across the ancient world. In this respect, Hatshepsut's leadership was not merely political. It was visionary in its scope and impact. Ultimately, Hatshepsut's story challenges us to rethink the meaning of leadership. Her reign suggests that leadership is not determined by gender, but by one's ability to inspire, lead, and innovate. It also reminds us that history is shaped by those who have the courage to step outside the boundaries set for them. In a world still grappling with issues of gender inequality and representation, Hatshepsut's legacy is an important reminder that the potential for greatness lies within everyone, regardless of gender. Hatshepsut's legacy matters today because it underscores the importance of recognizing and honoring the achievements of women throughout history, especially those who have been obscured by time and prejudice. Her story continues to resonate because it represents the power of overcoming societal constraints and forging a path towards self-determination and achievement. The lessons we can learn from Hatshepsut's life, about leadership, resilience, and the capacity to challenge the status quo, are as relevant today as they were thousands of years ago. Hatshepsut was more than just a woman who became a king. She was a symbol of what is possible when we transcend the limits imposed by tradition and embrace the fullness of our potential. Through her bold actions, Hatshepsut not only secured her place in Egyptian history, but also became a timeless figure who continues to inspire generations. Her story speaks to the enduring strength of human ambition and the transformative power of leadership.